Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, October 3. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Washington Times news organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all you do for the Washington Times Foundation and the Washington Brief. We're going to have a wonderful program today. We have a very special guest panelist. Mr. Greg Scarlachew is the executive director for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. Has been in that role for 10 years. He's a visiting professor in Hankook University of Foreign Studies and Yonsei University. Mr. Scarlachew is vice president of the International Council on Korean Studies and has been a Radio Free Asia Korean columnist for 20 years. He completed the MIT 21 seminar for U.S. national security leaders from 2016 to 2017 and has been awarded the title of Citizen of Honor by the city of Seoul, Korea. He was born and raised in communist Romania and is now a naturalized U.S. citizen. He is fluent in Korean, French, and Romanian. Today, our program is North Korea Human Rights, Status Quo versus Revisionist Powers. Our guest panelist, actually he's our regular panelist on every Tuesday, every first Tuesday of the month. Dr. Alexander Manzaroff is an adjunct professor for security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also is an adjunct professor of Korean studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our moderator today is Ambassador Joseph Detrani, very, very well known for many years in this field of intelligence and also in being an envoy for the United States to the six-party talks. He's a commentator on security issues, writes in very excellent op-eds for the Washington Times and many other media. He's on all the networks, and he's a very, very, very knowledgeable moderator he knows the China view, he knows the North Korean view personally, very special. He's also the director of the National Counterproliferation Center and associate director of national intelligence. He served in years past. So let's welcome at this time Ambassador Detrani. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was very nice of you. Thank you. We're very fortunate today to have the executive director of the Human Rights in North Korea, Greg Scarlachew. But this is a very special guest, a man who's worked, as Michael said, so many years on this issue of human rights, the dire human rights situation in North Korea. Look, there's so much to discuss today, and let me just open it up by saying this past month has been historic in so many ways. We've had Kim Jong-un meeting with Vladimir Putin in Russia to discuss their bilateral relationship. We've had the Camp David summit of South Korea with President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and President Joe Biden discussing if you will, the extended nuclear deterrence commitments on the part of the United States to our two very close allies in the region. This is the 70th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Republic of Korea and the United States on 1 October 1953, the 70th anniversary. And let me just say, there's so much to unpack when we talk about China and Russia as part of the UN Security Council. That's not been very supportive in sanctioning North Korea for some of their recent activities, their missile launches, and the potential for a seventh nuclear test. So with that, let me just open it up and look to our guest today. And I know we'll learn a great deal listening to the executive director of the Human Rights in North Korea, the executive director, Greg Scalato. Greg, over to you.
Joel, Michael, thank you very much for the decidedly undeserved introduction. I'm honored and humbled to be in such great company. You also happen to be my very good friends. So we talked about this and thought that rather than addressing only the North Korean human rights situation, we would look at North Korean human rights and measures needed in order to improve the North Korean human rights situation through slightly different lens. In particular, the lens of the ever-increasing tension between status quo powers and revisionist powers, if one looks at the UN Security Council in particular. Of course, this is no news to any of us. This was a dynamic that was specific to the Cold War. Perhaps one could argue that things are a little bit different now. Somehow somebody threw the rule book out the window. So I'm not going to get into too many details relating to the North Korean human rights situation. We all know that this year we celebrated 10 years since the establishment of the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korean human rights, on human rights in the DPRK. This was done through a resolution of the UN Human Rights Council. Basically, this was adopted by consensus by all members with no vote. In February of next year, we will be celebrating 10 years since the actual report of the UN Commission of Inquiry. Now, of course, the UN Commission of Inquiry came up with a set of findings and recommendations, and perhaps the best known of these recommendations is the recommendation that the North Korean regime be referred to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court. Why? Because the UN Commission of Inquiry found that many of the egregious human rights violations committed in North Korea pursuant to policies established at the highest level of the state amounted to crimes against humanity, especially those violations committed within North Korea's vast system of unlawful imprisonment. The regime is still running 5 political prison camps where up to 3 generations of the same family, pursuant to a system of guilt by association, Yeonjudge are held, men, women, children. Some of the recommendations of the UNCOI have been implemented, some have not. Basically, we have to take a hard look at what's happening in North Korea today. 10 years after the UNCOI report relating to the findings of this UNCOI, the perpetration of the human rights violations or crimes against humanity emphasized in the report has continued with no improvement. North Korea's security apparatus is thriving. Under the pretext of COVID prevention, North Korea has cracked down on those trying to access information from the outside world, and especially on those trying to smuggle in information from the outside world, in particular, any material coming in from South Korea. Travel inside the country was severely limited under COVID, and cross-border travel practically ground to a halt. Of course, these days, North Korea is gradually opening the border, as documented by civil society organizations, the UN, and governments, including the United States and the Republic of Korea. Crimes against humanity continue to be perpetrated, especially at North Korea's unlawful detention facilities. The overwhelming majority of UNCOI recommendations have not been implemented over the past decade. The main reasons, of course, include UN, government, and even NGO focus on procedure versus substance, increased Chinese influence over the office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the constant depletion of office of High Commissioner for Human Rights funding and human resources, and China is no stranger to this process, a lack of strategy, a lack of a control tower, a general lack of resources, and a deepening rift between revisionist permanent UN Security Council members, China and Russia and their allies, versus status quo members of the UN Security Council. We know what they are: the US, the UK, France, our allies, versus the status quo members of the UN. The UNCOI made 19 recommendations to the North Korean government. A fraction of one was actually materialized. One recommendation was to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They did it. Now, one cannot tell for sure whether this was the direct result of a recommendation made by the UNCOI. Perhaps they would have ratified the convention anyway, but, perhaps the UNCOI did play a role in this decision by the DPRK government. The North Korean regime has not ratified the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, or the core conventions of the International Labour Organization as recommended by the UNCOI. The UNCOI recommended the establishment of a field-based presence and technical assistance from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and other relevant UN entities to help implement all recommendations made to North Korea. Now, obviously, the recommendation of the UNCOI was the establishment of an office in Pyongyang. That didn't happen. However, one was established in Seoul in 2015. None of the recommendations that the UNCOI made to China and other states have been implemented. China continues its policy of refouling, of forcibly repatriating North Korean refugees to a place where they face a credible fear of persecution. This is a direct violation of China's obligations under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 additional protocol. Basically, this is the test. If a person is returned to a place where he or she faces a credible fear of persecution, they qualify to gain access to the process leading to acquiring political refugee status. Unfortunately, that is not the case with the North Korean refugees in China. There is deep concern these days, and you see civil society being mobilized here and there all over the world, in South Korea, here. There are over 2,000 North Korean refugees who have been in detention in China during COVID and post-COVID, with a gradual opening of the border. The grave concern here is that they probably face forcible repatriation, and basically a lot of civil society groups are trying to talk to governments, like-minded governments, trying to persuade them to halt, to stop that process of forcible repatriation across the Sino-DPRK border with the gradual opening of the border. Some of the recommendations to the UN and the international community have been implemented. For example, the extension of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the DPRK, reporting by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as regular reporting by the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. Accountability is already a very difficult task. Especially UN Security Council referral to the International Court of Justice, the ICC, has been rendered impossible by this deep rift and ever deepening rift between status quo permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, the UK, France, and the revisionist members, Russia and China. Now, truth be told, we, the United States of America, have our own issues with the ICC. Well, of course, it doesn't have to get there, because for sure, either China or Russia would block any attempts to refer North Korea to the ICC. Why the Security Council? Of course, my distinguished panelists know this very well, the audience as well. The issue of North Korean human rights has been placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council several times in 2014, 15, 16, 17, and then there was a 6-year gap. Finally, this year, 6 years later, the issue is placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Again, this is a procedural matter that requires the votes of 9 out of 15 permanent and non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. Now, taking up the issue and referring it, or attempting to refer it to the ICC, is a different matter. That's a substantive matter, and here the veto powers of P5 members apply. So it appears that would be a very difficult course of action. Now, why UN Security Council referral? Because the DPRK is not a party to the 2002 Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. Perhaps the most important recommendation of the UNCOI is a human rights upfront approach to North Korea. Moving forward, of course, strategy, coordination, and resources must be dedicated to that task. I have the privilege of being part of a group together with Ambassador Trani, a group led by Ambassador Robert Joseph, comprising both security, military, political security experts and human rights experts. We've produced a paper, we've engaged in fairly robust outreach. The idea here is that for over 30 years, we have been designing our North Korea policy, negotiating with North Korea, focusing, of course, on very important political, security, military issues. North Korea has nukes and missiles. After all, millions of lives are at stake. On the other hand, the human rights issue has often, or I would say always, been sacrificed for the sake of addressing these other very important issues. We argue in favor of elevating the importance of the North Korean human rights issue. With so many security experts in the room, I would take the liberty of referring to von Clausewitz's center of gravity, basically, and Clausewitz's Schwerpunkt. So, what is the center of gravity of the North Korean regime? Sasha, you have been a thorough scholar and student of everything North Korea for a long time. I know that you read a lot of original material. So what is it that has kept the regime in power? Is it the nuclear program? Is it the missile program? Of course, these are very important tools in the process of executing that fundamental strategic goal of maintaining the regime in power. On the other hand, the great vulnerability of the North Korean regime is its human rights record. The deep rift between the official ideology, Kim Il-sungism, the 10 principles of monolithic ideology, on the one hand, and on the other hand, North Korea's international obligations assumed under international treaties, under international instruments, and why not North Korea's own constitution, which unfortunately on paper only includes wonderful clauses on freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, none of these are observed. So, after having very quickly visited or revisited some of the very few successes and so far many failures in terms of implementing the recommendations of the UNCOI, to what extent are North Korea's allies to blame for what is happening in North Korea? Now, undoubtedly, North Korea learned how to set up its political prison camp system from Stalin and the Soviet Union, initially modeled upon the Gulag. It was then turned into a North Korean version of the Gulag. Kim Il-sung gave it his own personal touch. Generally, I tell my my younger colleagues to steer clear of comparisons. I see in particular our colleagues in South Korea very keen of comparing the North Korean situation with the Holocaust, with the Gulags. They're all terrible in their own way. And sometimes you have to spend time in Geneva or somewhere else in a room full of human rights defenders from all over the world facing their own terrible circumstances. I think the best thing to do is to listen, to share our own story, the North Korean story, and basically avoid these direct comparisons. So, what about Chinese responsibility? Of course, the one who is to blame in North Korea for these crimes against humanity, as the UNCOI pointed out, is the supreme leader and the chain of command and control that rules in particular over, that controls North Korea's detention system. As far as China is concerned, the biggest issue, of course, is one issue that I have already mentioned: refoulement, the forcible repatriation of North Korean refugees. Also, refusal to protect North Korean refugees. They have no legal status. China claims that they're illegal economic migrants. About 80% are women. They're really the bottom of the heap. They fall victim to human traffickers. They're forced into so-called marriages with Chinese men in rundown rural areas. I'm not saying that some of these so-called marriages do not turn out well. Probably some of them do, but we have had some terrible reports of abuse involving the families that these women married into. Another issue in China, of course, is that of North Koreans officially dispatched overseas. We're not talking refugees. We're talking those workers dispatched overseas to earn hard currency for the regime. Ambassador Trani mentioned Chinese and Russian reluctance to fully comply with UN Security Council resolutions. Of course, those resolutions do not rely on a human rights rationale. They aim to sever the sources of funding that fuel North Korea's nuclear and missile program, and overseas workers are regarded as such a source of funding. China has been opposed to country-specific mechanisms, of course, for a very long time. Why? For a very simple reason: the fear that you might be next. So China is against UN commissions of inquiry. China is against UN special rapporteurs. China does not recognize the status of the UN special rapporteur. The UN special rapporteur on human rights in the DPRK has not had access inside China so far. Of course, China is also opposed to any type of accountability mechanism. And being a P5 member, of course, this creates a problem, as stated earlier. Also, a little-known fact is that both China and Russia have had significant influence over the UN ECOSOC NGO committee. Currently, Russia is not a member of the committee, but they were a member for the longest time, and they'll probably come back. Currently, the members are Algeria, Armenia, Bahrain, Cameroon, Chile, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Eritrea, Georgia, India, Israel, Liberia, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Turkey, the United Kingdom, the USA, and Zimbabwe. So basically, this 19-member UN NGO committee, 5 African states, 5 Asian, 2 Eastern European, 4 Latin American, Caribbean, 4 Western European. This NGO committee holds the keys to access to the UN. They're the ones who grant UN ECOSOC consultative status. If, like us, you're an NGO dealing with human rights in North Korea, you will be kept on hold. You'll receive the same set of questions every 6 months, just a little bit of a change, and they'll keep you on hold for years, if not for decades. Fortunately, we had the support of US UN under the previous administration, Ambassador Haley. We were brought to a vote. They were shut down. The committee recommended to ECOSOC that we be benched. And fortunately, ECOSOC reversed the decision. Again, it was action by like-minded states, the USA, Canada, the European Union, and others. As far as Russia is concerned, traditionally, Russia, I have to say this, has been better than China on refugees. There has been better cooperation. Of course, the number of refugees in Russia has been lower than that of refugees in China. Russia has had the same issue with North Korean workers officially dispatched overseas. Of course, the working conditions are terrible. One has to remember that these sites are managed by North Koreans, by the party, the security agencies, and the technical supervisor. Russia has also opposed country-specific mechanisms for the same reasons. Russia has opposed accountability mechanisms for the same reason, and has yielded similar influence as China's over the UN ECOSOC NGO committee. Joe, I think you want me to stop here because I want to open this up to discussion. I could keep going for hours.
No, I think that's excellent, Greg. No, I mean, you really set the scene here, a very dire scene when you talk about the escapees from North Korea and the repatriation that China is doing of these escapees. It's so sad. And someone would say it's immoral. So let's open this up to a discussion and then some questions. And Alexander, if you would, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. And Greg, welcome to our show. Excellent presentation, really enjoyed it. And let me make a couple of points and then ask you a question. First of all, what I appreciate the most about your presentation is a very nuanced approach which you are taking. You're not really vilifying the North Korean regime. You're not demonizing it like so many other people in the human rights community are doing. Again, with your experience, with your background, I'm glad that you see a difference between the gulag of the past, of the Soviet times, or the Holocaust experience, and that the Jewish people suffered, and that you're advising, analysts and advocates of human rights to avoid direct comparisons with those historical experiences. So I commend you for that, because I believe, just like you do, that we need to assess the North Korean human rights record on its own merits. And it's pathetic. It's a poor human rights record. I mean, the penitentiary system is barbaric. I mean, it lacks transparency. It's highly politicized. The conditions basically medieval in the penitentiary system, and there is no due process there. There is no question about it. And so I commend you for, again, telling everybody to look at North Korean situation on its own merits, human rights situation, and stop demonizing it, because it will not get us too far in our efforts to improve the human rights there. So that's my first observation. The second one, you raised an important question about the resilience of the North Korean regime, essentially saying that the human rights record is one of the major vulnerabilities of that regime. But that's not the only one, and I agree with you. There are several pillars supporting that regime, from Chuche ideology, and the regime, of course, does everything it can through political and ideological indoctrination to make sure that from the day child is born until the end of the life, the North Korean people basically are exposed to the same Chuche ideas in all phases of their life, because the threat of group heresy challenging the Chuche ideology is there. We saw it in the past, and the regime does its best to prevent it from happening. Fear, another major regime pillar, and of course, the regime relies on a monstrous repressive apparatus to make sure that individual grievances would not get out of hand, out of control. The third pillar of the regime support is isolation, as you correctly pointed out. And the regime keeps its borders very tight, especially during the pandemic. Now, social stratification helps the regime to kind of keep the people isolated, not only from the outside world, but from each other. And so the society opening, as well as the allowing of free flow of information into North Korea would go a long way to undermine that particular pillar supporting the regime. And finally, elite consensus. Last but not least pillar supporting the regime, it's the elite consensus, which the ruling party does its best to kind of cement and make sure that nothing undermines it. So again, in that sense, because you highlighted human rights as a major point of vulnerability of the regime, my question is very simple. Kim Jong-un has been in power for 12 years. As a matter of fact, he is second to the longest serving leader of Northeast Asia. He served in that leadership position longer than Japanese prime ministers, South Korean presidents, Chinese president. Only President Putin served longer in his leadership position. And yet Kim Jong-un is a young leader. I mean, he's only 39, unlike his other foreign counterparts. So my question is simple. Is the state of human rights under Kim Jong-un today better or worse than 12 years ago under his father, Kim Jong-il, let alone 30 years ago under his grandfather, Kim Il-sung? A very simple question, whether you see any evolution for the better or for worse. And the reason why I ask this question is because last week we saw an unprecedented development. Travis King was released by North Korea. No negotiations, no preconditions, no questions asked, essentially. This never happened before. We know, what it took in the past to get Americans released from North Korean custody. Now, 3 weeks ago, Kim Jong-un rejected Russian offer of humanitarian aid, of food aid, saying, I don't need these handouts. I want equal trade in agricultural products. So, and I can give you a bunch of other examples, but I see those signs of novelty, if you which I didn't see before, which have direct bearing on human security in North Korea or the way they treat their people and foreigners. And so my question is simple. Is the condition of human rights today, the government's approach to human rights in North Korea today, is it worse or is it better? And since you've been focused on it for so many years, you are the best expert to give us a straight answer on this one.
Sasha, it is not better. And these are also different times. Let me go to a comparison. North Koreans under COVID had a really, really hard time, as you know very well. They cracked down on the markets. Basically, people who were making bread buns out of their homes and selling them on the streets were no longer allowed to do that. That's how intense this was. They cracked down on the border. They cracked down on information coming in from the outside world, those attempting to distribute information, those attempting to access information. So talking to sources inside North Korea, in absolute terms, what we heard from multiple sources was that the humanitarian situation and the human security situation were on par with the days of the Great Famine, in particular in the urban areas. However, compared to the days of the Great Famine, at the grassroots level, as we all know, there has been this process of marketization of North Korea that had very little to do with, or nothing to do with, top-down reform. It was something that started at the grassroots. So in absolute terms, the situation was comparable. In relative terms, people were better off because they had developed those survival mechanisms. Travis King, I have to say, took me by surprise. I predicted that because, we only have the record, all, as you said, all other deserters, all other U.S. Army deserters went through a very rough debriefing process. They cleared it. Some of them died at a young age of heart attacks and so on and so forth. Those who decided to stay and cooperate became movie stars. So I thought he'd take the same route, but they surprised everybody. Maybe just to keep us guessing, maybe because so many of us were predicting that he would be having a terrible time in North Korea. Well, so be it. A dent on the Korea Watcher's reputation in exchange for this young man's life. I think it's a very fair deal. It's an isolated case. Of course, what's a little heartening is that we thanked the Chinese government for their cooperation in the release of Travis King. I thought that was very important. Perhaps we'll find out the details later. So again, it's a positive development. And I think that whenever we see a positive development, we have to acknowledge it. This is the only way to lead the North Korean regime into the right direction. There are so many other ways of doing this. Next year, North Korea is up again for the Universal Periodic Review, the UPR. Last time we were there, we submitted a written submission. I spoke at the UPR session. One recommendation by Ireland was that North Korea allow humanitarian access to its detention facilities. Guess what they said? Yes. Okay. So, of course, we're not talking kwalliso political prison camps. We're talking kyohwaso, re-education through labor camps. But whenever there is a little bit of an opening, I think we have to follow through. And as you said, sometimes we're blinded by the mission. We're so focused on the evil of the Kim regime that we fail to see these possibilities for slight openings. It's important to see that. So in absolute terms, things are on par with what was happening during Kim Jong-il. In relative terms, due to marketization and some new technologies that have been adopted even by North Korea, in relative terms, things are better.
Thank you, Greg. No, I think that's an outstanding answer to a very good question. Greg, let me ask you this. You mentioned the UN Security Council. They just had a session on human rights, the first in 10 years on the situation in North Korea, and it spoke about a very dire situation, malnourishment, the potential for starvation. You mentioned a minute ago that in the 1990s, we saw many people, the estimates are 1 million plus people dying of starvation And we know over 40% of the population is malnourished. And that came out of the recent UN Security Council report on the human rights situation in North Korea. So the human rights situation in North Korea is dire, and it's so tragic. So tragic if we talk about malnourishment and we talk about the potential for starvation again. And you mentioned early on about information not getting into North Korea. And many people would say, when we were talking about denuclearization and a process that would lend itself to normalization of relations with North Korea, where North Korea would get foreign direct investment, they'd be part of the community of nations, and there would be interactions. Many people would say, well, the regime would feel threatened by going down that path. And I would agree with that. But the fact of the matter is there are 25 million people in North Korea who are suffering. And that's the focus. And to get information into the people of North Korea. And you talked about a report that recently has been done by you and a number of colleagues, Ambassador Joseph, myself, and a few others, where we are saying human rights up front. And we're hearing that from the Biden administration. We're hearing that from the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, where it's human rights up front, talking about the situation in North Korea. It's not only the nuclear, and obviously we have to address the nuclear issue, because North Korea with nuclear weapons is destabilizing. Destabilizing for the Korean Peninsula, destabilizing for the region, for the world. And it's a question of proliferation. Other countries will seek nuclear weapons if North Korea retains those nuclear weapons, despite the Washington Declaration and our commitments for nuclear deterrence commitments, extended deterrence commitments to other countries, allies, and partners. So we know denuclearization is important, but 25 million people are still suffering based on the recent study that came out of the United Nations Security Council. So that's the reality. So we have to reach the people. Maybe the people can influence the government to change, to spend some of the foreign resources they have, and they certainly get a lot of resources through their cyber activities, their illicit activities, where we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, up to $1 billion through cyber alone. So we have to change that equation. And there needs to be an impetus there, and there needs to be a sense. And now we see, and I'll get to this, the last comment, and then I'll get to my question. Now we see North Korea working closely with the Russian Federation, as we saw with the visit with Vladimir Putin, and working closely with Xi Jinping with China. And Iran is part of that axis also. So when you see this sort of coming together, and you know China and Russia were part of the six-party process. I don't think China and Russia want to see North Korea retain nuclear weapons, because they have to be just as concerned about the destabilizing effect of North Korea having nuclear weapons and the whole question of nuclear proliferation in the region and beyond. So there is that element. So there's so many dynamics going on. So my question to you is this, Greg. If we see this confluence of issues that are coming together, is there any way we can work with Russia and China to get them to realize it's not only denuclearization, although they're not supporting any Security Council resolutions criticizing, condemning North Korea for their missile launches, to include the Hwasong-18, which is an ICBM, mobile, solid fuel ICBM that can reach the whole of the United States and indeed the region also. So is there any way of reaching out to Russia and China? And you mentioned some progress with China on the Travis King release. So China obviously played some sort of a role in that. But could we work with China and Russia to get them to move? Or is the war in Ukraine such an impediment to doing anything with Russia? So it has to be a focus on China. And is there some likelihood, do you think, that China would not only support the denuclearization of North Korea, but would consider and change their policy on the repatriation of those escapees who are in China and face a very, very severe situation when they go back to North Korea, if they're sent back, and China in the past has sent them back. What are the prospects for making some progress? And the last part of my question is, how effective can we be to get information into North Korea, to get the 25 million people to stop and understand what their government is doing to them by putting all the money into nuclear and missiles and not into feeding them and getting them the hospitalization and the medical care that they need? Over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Joe. As far as Russia is concerned, under the current circumstances, it's nearly impossible for as long as the conflict in Ukraine is still ongoing. Of course, nothing lasts forever. Relations change, dynamics shift. But under the current circumstances, realistically, there isn't much we can do. On China, as you said, Joe, of course, the biggest issue, something that China could resolve immediately, as in today or tomorrow, would be, number one, to prevent the forcible repatriation of these 2,000 plus North Korean refugees as an immediate step and a gesture of goodwill. Number two, halt, cease, and desist the policy of forcible repatriation of North Korean refugees. Justice Michael Kirby, the head of the UN Commission of Inquiry, appended a letter to the UNCOI report, a letter addressed to the Chinese authorities, where he was warning them that through their policy of forcible repatriation or refoulement, they were aiding and abetting a regime that was committing crimes against humanity. Now, in addition to this, I would like to make another point. Of course, the Camp David summit was an extraordinary event. We saw strategic vision on all issues that are important to trilateral coordination and the trilateral alliance, if there is such thing. And human rights was mentioned, of course, but human rights were the only area that seemed to suffer from a lack of strategic vision. Okay, in South Korea, President Yoon Suk-yeol is obviously fully dedicated to this issue. So is Minister Kim Yong-ho, the Minister of Unification. Now, in South Korea, across the Ministry of Unification, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and other governmental and non-governmental agencies tasked to address North Korean human rights, there is a perennial lack of coordination. With the appointment of Korea University's Professor Lee Shin-hwa as Ambassador at Large on North Korean human rights issues, this happened for the first time in 6 years, just like the UN Security Council placing the issue on the agenda. The portfolio of Ambassador Lee Shin-hwa is established under the South Korean Foreign Ministry. It is underfunded and understaffed. In the United States, we saw a very positive development. The appointment of a spectacularly qualified candidate, Julie Turner, whom Sasha and I and you know very well as Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues, again for the first time in 6 years. And yet, whether intentionally or circumstantially, unintentionally, the search, nomination, and confirmation process was delayed for a considerable period of time, and she's not being sworn in. With just over a year left in the first mandate of the Biden administration, the special envoy has not been sworn in yet. So, UN Human Rights Security Council, UN Human Rights Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, Security Council open sessions on North Korean human rights are all important tactical steps. But what we need, if we are to stand a chance to make the Chinese change their mind, is to consolidate the coalition of like-minded states capable of attacking the cog, the Schwerpunkt, this vulnerability of the Kim regime. I'm talking the United States, South Korea, Japan, the European Union. As far as I know, South Korea played a very important role in organizing and putting together the Camp David summit. South Korea is playing a constructive leadership role. We need three things. I call it SDR, a coherent strategy. We don't have it. A coherent strategy on North Korean human rights. We don't have it yet. A control tower to coordinate the strategy. We don't have it yet. and the requisite resources to implement it. So in order to stand a chance, Joe, in my view, to persuade the Chinese, we need this coalition to come together. We need resources, we need the control tower, and we need a coherent strategy, not just slogans. Of course, we have our paper. You asked about information. That's a great question. The recommendation that we made, we have the content. We have the vehicles to deliver information inside North Korea. What we recommend is to tell the North Koreans three stories: the story of the corruption of their own leadership, in particular the inner core of the Kim family regime, the story of their own human rights, which they don't understand, and the story of the outside world, in particular the story of South Korea. None of us claim to be perfect. Democracies do not claim to be perfect. The North Koreas and Venezuelas of the world claim to be perfect. Tell them the story of South Korea as is: prosperous, world's 11th largest economy, democratized, still struggling with a couple of challenges, but again, a wonderful country which we all like, love, and admire. So it's as simple as that, but so far we have lacked, since the end of the Cold War, we have lacked the resources and the political will to engage in a truly effective information campaign. It has been a half-hearted approach modeled on the Cold War model, which was, of course, very effective. I was at the receiving end of Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other stations, Deutsche Welle, BBC.
Wow, that's a very, very powerful response. Thank you so much, Greg. Alexander, over to you, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I know we're running out of time, so I have a couple of very quick questions. Greg, the human rights agenda in North Korea is broader than, the internal situation there. It also covers the issue of Japanese abductees, as well as the separated, divided families in the South and North Korea. So my first question is, in light of the North Korean-Japanese contacts last March and last May at the cabinet level in Japan, and basically intelligence contacts discussing reportedly the abductee issue, what, in your opinion, are the prospects for the resolution of the issue of Japanese abductees? That's number one. And number two, on the question of divided families, the reunion of the divided Korean families is, of course, a race against time because their numbers are dwindling rapidly. So my question is simple: what can be done to expedite the resolution of this burning issue, especially in the context of the South Korean government deciding to basically cut down in size the unification ministry and reduce its budget and reorient its missions?
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Sasha. Of course, in 2002, Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi and Kim Jong-il met, and Kim Jong-il, surprise, surprise, admitted to the fact that rogue agents had abducted Japanese nationals. We know what happened later. Some of them, including Hitomi Soga, wife of Charles Jenkins, U.S. Army deserter, managed to return to Japan. Kim Jong-il failed to understand the nature of Japanese civil society. Abductees' families groups will never, ever cease and desist until the last one of them has been accounted for, which is, I would say, nearly impossible. Of course, Kim Jong-il, after the Sunshine Policy, was hoping to score another coup, receiving Japanese more or less, not unconditional, but predicated upon the abductee issue, Japanese investment, aid, and so on and so forth. He probably experienced a great sense of betrayal. He probably passed that on to his son. So a great obstacle in the way of resolving the issue of Japanese abductees is the very legacy of the Kim family regime, the father's legacy. Then the abductees have come across information that is not supposed to get out of the country. Many of them were involved in training overseas operatives of various North Korean intelligence agencies, including the two agents that placed the bomb on Cal 852 in 1987, to the North Korean regime. This is very dangerous information. Our Japanese colleagues say that, well, you know, they would make sure, promise, and sign paperwork that they will not disclose this and that. Again, difficult. That is to say, if Japan were to find some type of resolution to this issue and give the North Korean regime something in exchange, you know, in that case, I think that everyone in civil society and elsewhere should stand down, acknowledge this as a victory on the human rights front, and basically focus on the victims. Extraordinarily difficult, I think. Then this is another very important issue. And it's really hard, quite frankly, interacting with the families of abductees, interacting with the families of separated families. Out of 130,000 applicants for separated family reunions, only 40,000 are alive today, I think.
In Korea. So
In Korea.
let's separate Japan from South Korea. Okay.
Yeah. It's from South Korea. And I think about 10,000 of them are in their 90s. So this is clearly a very urgent humanitarian issue. So everything else is very important. It's a very important humanitarian issue. There are members of Congress here in the United States that are trying to get this done. Basically, reunions between Korean Americans and their separated families in North Korea. The Minister of Unification in South Korea, I believe Minister Kim Yong-ho, has made this one of his priorities. So in my view, if there were to be some type of inter-Korean exchange under the Yoon administration, I agree with you, Sasha. This is an urgent issue. These senior citizens are disappearing fast. This could be a very positive first step of re-engaging through an issue that is both a human rights issue and a humanitarian issue fundamentally.
No, I think that's an excellent question, Sasha, an excellent response. You know, if there could be some intra-Korean dialogue on bringing the separated families together, there's no question that is so powerful. And then let me go beyond that on the abductee issue that you talked about, Greg. That's so important, and we hear that from certainly the former prime ministers, but indeed Prime Minister Kishida, the importance of resolving this issue. So let me posit this. You know, we talk often through the six-party process and beyond about the denuclearization issue. And of course, that's an important issue, denuclearization. But on the other side of the equation, to show some confidence building on the part of the North Koreans, Kim Jong-un has the option of giving some sort of leeway, showing some progress on the human rights issue by closing some of those political concentration camps, by permitting greater transparency, as you said, Greg, to some of these facilities. And that would be a very significant confidence building measure on the part of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, to show progress on the human rights issue. And indeed, it's not only a question of stopping the production of fissile material and no more missile launches and no nuclear tests, but progress on the human rights issue. So my question to you is this: should we be pushing this? And do you see any possibility, further to the question that Alexander asked you earlier, that maybe, and we saw this with the release of Travis King, maybe North Korea would want to show some confidence building initiatives on their part by saying, look, we're doing something on the human rights issue here. We're giving you greater transparency. We're working on humanitarian aid so that we can work on the malnourishment issue. We're working on an infrastructure so that we could feed our own people. And we're putting some of those resources we have, not only into the nuclear and missile programs, but into feeding our people and also getting them better, if you will, medical care. So do you think the Kim Jong-un government would be amenable to showing some progress in this area? Or do you see them so entrenched now in saying, as we just saw recently at the Special People's Assembly, that they've now enshrined the nuclear issue into their constitution? And there is not going to be any progress from North Korea, and that we should just forget it. And they're going to be part of the Russia, China, or Iran, and they're on that side. I think that would be defeatism if we just accepted that. So I would still push on denuclearization, but progress on human rights and showing that there's something there. Do you think that's a possibility, Greg? And how would you craft a strategy to move us in that direction to see if we can get some progress from the Kim Jong-un government on that very important issue of human rights?
That is a very important point, Joe, and it's not cliche because, well, just President Reagan, his favorite Russian proverb, right? Trust but verify. The problem is that before verification, we talk about CVID, FFVD, there is no trust. There is zero trust. And I fully agree, Joe, that human rights, this avenue of human rights could help build some trust for Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime. Now, how would we do this? Well, first and foremost, we would have to come up with a very simple set of asks. For example, when it comes to humanitarian assistance, transparency, monitoring, evaluation, upholding internationally accepted standards of monitoring, evaluation, and transparency when humanitarian assistance is disbursed to make sure it reaches the most vulnerable segments of the population. Number two, make sure that humanitarian assistance reaches the most vulnerable segments of the population, human rights up front. This includes children, the elderly, women, pregnant women, and people in detention. Admit to the existence of the political prison camps and allow access. Okay, before that, at least allow humanitarian access and international technical assistance to address other detention facilities, the Kyohwa So re-education through labor camps. By the way, they admit to the existence of those facilities. Kyohwa Hyung re-education through labor is in the North Korean criminal code. So, yes, nuclear weapons are in their constitution. They regard the nuclear program as critical, instrumental in executing their top strategic objective, preserving the regime. How good are our chances? Not very good. There is no ZOPA, no zone of possible agreement, of course. But you're right. It doesn't mean that we should succumb to defeatism. So once we know exactly what we're asking for, what do we do? Okay, we publish papers, we write op-eds, we take them to the UN, we talk to UN agencies, we talk to UN member states, and why not? We try to seek ways to bring this message to the North Koreans as well. I mean, of course, what they said about a lot of human rights organizations, including us, hasn't been nice. I mean, that's how propaganda works in North Korea. Sasha knows this very well. But, you know, perhaps Travis King, what do we make of this? Is it a one-time occurrence, or could this be an opening?
Yes.
The visit by the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of people with disabilities to North Korea, Mrs. Aguilar, she didn't make a big deal out of it. She knows it's a Potemkin village. She was shown only the things that they wanted her to see. But nevertheless, within this terrible context of North Korea, within the terrible isolation of North Korea, these are possible openings. We need to capitalize on these openings.
Thank you, Greg. That is just outstanding. What a great response. What a great discussion. Alexander, I want to thank you. And Greg, I can't say enough. We can't all say enough about what you do running the Human Rights in North Korea organization. Your work is powerful. Keep at it. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Greg. What a wonderful program. What a serious program. We had a window into North Korea today that has been very unique and also quite urgent. But also I felt there's so much that can continue to be done because we're not in an angry mode. We're there to try to solve problems and try to help the people of North Korea. Thank you, Dr. Manzaroff. Always, you're so insightful. And what a wonderful Washington brief we've had again, Joe. It's just amazing.
Thank you, Michael.
We want to thank the Washington Times that makes it a point to cover this brief every month. And Chris Dolan, the president of the Times, sees to that. And Guy Taylor, our national security reporter, team leader and reporter. Also, I want to thank the Universal Peace Federation. They are also a sponsor of this program. And we are looking forward to seeing the day when we can hold a conference in Pyongyang. We're very interested in pursuing that. There is some delegations that are related with the Universal Peace Federation that have diplomatic relations with the North and are able to go there on UPF's behalf. So Ambassador Trani, your role has been so critical to build friendships and keep those friendships going. So we're looking at how to communicate and dialogue better. Greg, we need you right in the mix. So thank you very much for this program. I'm looking forward to our next month's program. Thank you all.